Hello, my name is Heather Meeker, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you today about this topic, from project to profit, the growing world of open source based business. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you today, and I hope you find this presentation interesting and informative. A little about me to start. I am a lawyer and a venture capitalist investor working in the United States, and in both respects, I specialize in open source software. I'm going to talk to you today about some of the ideas that I have drawn on my experience to hold about open source based businesses. So let's get started. Today we're going to talk about three main topics. The first one is economic sustainability. The second is COS business models. And by the way, the acronym COS is for commercial open source software. So you will hear me say that a number of times during the presentation. And this means businesses that are built around open source software. And the last topic, I'm going to talk about Chinstrap Community, which is a website and community materials, a project that I have started with a co-founder that is intended to provide people with more information about this topic. It's all free of charge, and it is intended to build a community among people who are interested in this topic. First, let's talk about economic sustainability. I'm sure you've all heard that one of the big challenges for open source projects is how to sustain them. So let's first talk about how that happens. There are at least a couple of, shall we say, traditional ways of approaching economic sustainability for open source projects. The most traditional one is what I would term the community, or I would call it sweat equity. And that term means when people create equity in something by their own labor. And if you think about the way that most open source projects were started very early on in the open source movement, this was mostly what they were about. They were started by developers and contributors who wanted to create the project, and all of those people worked as volunteers. So while it may seem on face that that means there's no resources necessary, at least no monetary resources necessary to create and sustain the project, in fact, what happens there is that the people who are working on the project are giving their own time, which of course they could use on projects that would pay them money, because most of them are very skilled programmers. And the issue that I'm sure you've heard about with the community or sweat equity way of funding projects is that the people who are working on the projects often get burnt out, or they just feel like they're not being supported. And so they sometimes give up maintaining the project. When we talk about economic sustainability, one of the most important things we're talking about is how a project can stay healthy. And that means that it's maintained properly. Even if a project works perfectly, as far as what its software does, over time, it needs to be maintained so that it remains secure, so that it remains compatible with the latest technological developments. And so software can never be static. If it's going to be a healthy project, it has to grow over time. And that means that there has to be some method of funding that growth of the project. Another way that historically open source projects have been funded, maybe not so much in the United States as in some other places, is public funding. So there might be nonprofit organizations that fund open source projects, or a lot of open source projects are started in academic environments like universities. And there, the people who are funding the ongoing development of the project are the people who are funding the NGO or the university. And that sometimes comes from taxpayer money, sometimes from donor money, and so forth. By the way, I'm sure you've heard that there are open source foundations like the Linux Foundation and the Apache Foundation that help with open source projects, but those projects are not, strictly speaking, funded by those organizations. Those organizations are a way to organize funding by outside sources. So these are traditional ways of funding open source projects. But as time goes on, what has happened is that many more projects are being funded by private capital. So some people in the open source community feel that private capital funding of open source is not consistent with the ethos of open source. And I won't, argue that that's true or not true here, but I want to point out why private capital funding of open source projects has become so popular and so effective in recent years. From the point of view of an investor, and remember I told you I was an investor, open source based companies are incredibly efficient in their use of capital. So first, let me clarify that when I talk about a COS company or commercial open source software company, what I mean is a company that is centered around an open source project or multiple open source projects. I'm not talking about companies that just happen to use other people's open source software. You'll see more about what I mean there as I give some examples later in the presentation, but a business that is really formed around an open source project. So why are businesses like that capital efficient? Well, open source projects tend to run on a shoestring, right? The people who develop open source software are accustomed to working remotely. Even before the pandemic happened, they were all working remotely and collaborating remotely. In fact, I've talked to companies where there are a couple of founders and they've never even met each other in person. They have always worked remotely. They don't require a lot of real estate and so forth. So they use the capital that they raise in order to build the business in an extremely efficient manner. What that means for an investor is that if you put a certain amount of money into the business, you have the possibility of getting a much greater return than you would get for a business that requires a lot of capital to start. The second advantage for building a cost business is branding. So if you create a good open source project, one of the things that is likely to happen if the project is healthy and successful is that a lot of people will find out about it without you having to do any advertising or any traditional expense on marketing. The thing about open source projects is, particularly open source projects that are aimed at developers, they like to recommend open source projects to each other. There are a lot of discussion groups where people talk about which open source projects they like. And so you can develop a lot of interest in your product without actually going out and buying advertising and so forth. Also, people like open source software. It has a good feeling around it. And so from that point of view, there is a huge branding advantage for open source based businesses. Third, a low cost of sales. So this is part of the capital efficiency argument, but when you run a business that surrounds an open source project, people who will adopt your software tend to find out about it by word of mouth. And that means that you don't have to expend a lot of money on a professional sales force. Most of the sales that you have, the leads that you get either come from your community or they come from people that are talking about your project. And so that means that you spend less money on a professional sales force. I should mention here that in enterprise software sales, cost of sales can actually be very high. And so anything that you can do to reduce the cost of sales would be very good for the company. And then finally, there is what I would call a high consumer surplus, and that's an economic term. Consumer surplus is when I buy a product of any kind, I'm not going to buy it unless the value to me is at least as much as the price I'm paying for it. And the thing about costs is that it creates a huge amount of consumer surplus, meaning that cost businesses deliver a huge amount of value and they don't actually monetize all the value they deliver. So people really like businesses like this, and they have a good feeling about the product, and that means they're more likely to be loyal consumers of the product. Also, the fact that a product is open source means that the buyers can have a certain comfort about particular things. There's actually quite a few things. I'll just mention a couple. The first is privacy. So if you have open source software, you always have the option of running it in a private cloud or on premises, and that will help you control the use of your data. So businesses that have a high sensitivity about privacy really like open source software as a commercial product. And also business continuity. The open source software licenses mean that anybody can maintain the project. So even if the vendor goes out of business, you can still actually have the right to continue using the software and have somebody maintain it for you. So when you add all those together, it looks like a very good investment. Now, this is borne out by the facts. What I've got on this slide here is something called cosmology, which is something that my project Chinstrap community is working on. This is a work in progress, by the way. And what we've been trying to do is to provide a catalog of all the cost businesses. The reason we've been trying to do this is to raise awareness about how successful this business model is. I still have people coming to me all the time claiming that it's impossible to make money with open source software, and that is really demonstrably not true. There are a lot of extremely successful businesses in the cost space. Now, what you see on this slide is total funding of cost companies and total valuation of cost companies. These figures are, you have to look at them as just examples because we are still building out this database. I would expect they're actually quite low. But the point is that when you have a sector that has a valuation of over $250 billion, that's a meaningful sector in the economy. So there are plenty of successful businesses in this area. We're trying to build the data to explain to people, that that's true. Another thing is that cost businesses are now present in all sectors. So if you roll the clock back maybe 15 years ago, you would find that almost all cost businesses were in the area of infrastructure or maybe middleware. So the most famous cost business, of course, is Red Hat. And they distribute Linux, a Linux distro, and that's infrastructure, in other words, operating systems. As costs became more popular, it moved into the middleware space. And what I mean by that is things like database monitoring and so forth. You saw a lot of businesses, cost businesses in the database or related space. And an example I've given of that is Redis, but there are many more. And in the past, maybe 5 to 10 years, what we've seen is costs moving into the application space. The, the poster child for this these days is Grafana, which is a very famous piece of software, and that is also a cost business. So at this point, a type of business model that started with infrastructure and that some people said would only work for infrastructure is now working through the entire software stack. Okay, now I'm going to talk about some business models. So people ask me all the time, how do you make money giving software away? Well, here's the essential question. So here's a picture of a car, and it's been taken apart into all of its constituent components. So the question I want to ask you is, if you wanted a car to drive and I told you that I would give you this car for free, no charge, would you take it? And the answer to that is no, I don't want a car that has to be assembled. I want a car that I can drive. And I'm willing to pay money. I'm willing to pay much more money for a car I can drive, because this car on this slide, I might not be able to put it together. Even if I were very skilled and had the time and the inclination to put it together, I probably couldn't get anybody to maintain it for me because it would probably have some quirks. It might not even be street legal to drive. This is what the cost model is about. So, source code, which is what is licensed under open source licenses, is like the pieces to the car. And the car is a finished product. And what you are selling people when you are selling a cost product is the difference in value between the tools to make a product and the finished product. So there are many business models that employ this idea. They all just do it in a little bit of a different way. For instance, there is something called open core, and that is where the core of the product is open source, but then there are additional features that usually they're features that are specifically for larger enterprise users that you have to pay for. So it's a hybrid model where you've got open source with the core, and then some upsell features that you're actually charging for. The open source core, of course, is free of charge. And then there are businesses that are SaaS or SaaS hybrid. So an example of that would be perhaps WordPress. So, WordPress, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. It's a business that has created the world's most popular blogging software, and it does a lot more as well. But what that company sells is serving up your blogging software to you. So I could run an instance of WordPress if I wanted to, but I don't want to because it would be extra work for me, and I am perfectly willing to pay WordPress to serve up the blog for me. That's a very simple example, and it is focused on consumer software. But these days, a lot of enterprise software that is open source is also being sold to enterprise. And the main thing there is that what the person wants is a finished product, not the tools to run the product. And they're willing to pay for the difference between those. One thing that people say is that if you're the CTO of a company and you're looking to buy a software product, you want something that's plug and play. You don't want to have to worry about it. And that's why you're often willing to pay a cost company to serve up the product to you rather than running it on your own. If you run it on your own, you have to hire engineers and people to make sure it's maintained and so forth. Then there are companies that do dual licensing. And what that means is you have a software product that is under something like the GPL or the Affero GPL, and you sell exceptions to that for people who want to use the software on other terms. The company MySQL pioneered that model. Today, Grafana is probably the most well-known example of it. And there are a whole lot of other models. For instance, one of the examples on the slide is Blue Sky, which is basically a content delivery system. It's, a social media. And the technology for that is open source. It's the content that is valuable. But there are other models as well. By the way, I'll say one more thing before moving on, and that is that for a long time, people have made money doing support or professional services for open source, and that's great. But that kind of business is not scalable because it requires a lot of human resources. And so those tend to be businesses that are smaller and that are more like a job for the person who is running it, and they don't tend to be backed by investors. Here's a little bit about Open Core, a further example of what I mentioned. So the core might be under something like Apache 2, which is a permissive license. It's very common for Open Core for the core to be under a permissive license. And then you will have proprietary upsell features, and those might be SOC 2 compliance, single sign-on, logging, and so forth. The kinds of functionality that a larger enterprise would need. And those proprietary elements, those would be sold under proprietary licenses or via SaaS, so they wouldn't be free of charge like the open source portion is. Okay, so before I end today, I'm going to talk about Chinstrap community and other resources so that if you want to learn more about this, you can. Chinstrap community is, as I said, it's a resource that I started with a partner, and our aim is to spread the news about this business model. You see, we love commercial open source software. We think it's a great alternative to community and government support of open source, which is not to say that those other models aren't great. They are, but it's an alternative that can help with economic sustainability. And we want to see more of these businesses succeed. We offer free workshops that you can sign up for. We do these for founders of companies, investors, so they can learn more about why open source businesses are good investments. And we also do it for people who are professionals, technology professionals in university and academic settings. So we have special workshops for all of those. We also, as I mentioned, we have our cosmology database, and we track a lot of the companies that are in this space. We do some news and analysis on our site, and just for fun, we have something called Ask Cosmo, which is an AI chatbot that answers questions about open source and commercial open source software. And you see there our logo is, his name is Cosmo, by the way. We chose this name and this logo because he's a penguin, and the penguin is kind of the mascot of the free software movement. You've all seen Tux the Penguin, but he's a chinstrap penguin because chinstrap penguins are they're very like feisty penguins, and also it's playing on the word of bootstrapping, which is kind of how commercial open source businesses happen. They're usually bootstrapped with very few resources, and we welcome you to come and join our community. We also have social media channels and everything, and we would love you to come and take a look and give us feedback and share in our interest in this area. Also, if you're interested in a deep dive, I have a book called From Project to Profit, but I also have a book on open source software licensing, which is free of charge. If you go to my website, you can follow the instructions to download a free copy of it. So all of this information is freely available to you, and I hope you take advantage of it. And that's it. I want to thank you for your kind attention today. I'm really honored to be able to talk to you today. I hope you have a wonderful time listening to the other presentations and talking with each other. And I hope that you will share my love of commercial open source software. Thank you very much.